John J. Chapman.
By the time the nation was founded, slavery was dying in the North. There were doubts in the South, too, but few could conceive of any alternative. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia said maintaining slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let it go. Then in 1793, a Northerner, Eli Whitney, taught the South how to make slavery pay. Whitney's engine, or gin, made it easier to separate cotton from its seed. Where before it had taken one slave 10 hours to produce a single pound of lint, the cotton gin could crank out 1,000 pounds a day. Production soared, and with it, the demand for slaves. By 1860, the last year of peace, 1 out of every 7 Americans belonged to another American. 4 million men, women, and children were slaves. In Boston in 1831, claiming that which is not just is not law, William Lloyd Garrison began publishing a militant anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. He called for complete and immediate abolition.
I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard.
He was heard, and his message was clear. Slavery was sin, and those who maintained it, criminals.
Hallelujah, it's done. I believe on the Son.
The abolition movement grew, inspired by passionate leaders. Harriet Tubman called Moses by the slaves who followed her north to freedom. Wendell Phillips named the Golden Trumpet of abolitionism for his oratory. And Frederick Douglass, the son of a slave and a white man.
I appear this evening as a thief and robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master and ran off with them.
Douglass was so eloquent that skeptics charged he could never have been a slave. In part to prove them wrong, he wrote an autobiography, purchased his freedom with $600 obtained from English admirers, and returned to the struggle.
The abolitionists would raise the Negroes to a social and political equality with the whites, and that being effected, we would soon see the present condition of the two races reversed. They and their northern allies would be the masters, and we the slaves. John C. Calhoun.
More and more Southerners worried about the growing political as well as economic power of the North. Northerners were increasingly hostile to slavery. Still, most Southerners refused to acknowledge even the possibility of changing their way of life.
On the north bank of the Ohio, everything is activity, industry. Labor is honored. There are no slaves. Pass to the south bank, and the scene changes so suddenly that you think yourself on the other side of the world. The enterprising spirit is gone. Alexis de Tocqueville.
We are separated because of incompatibility of temper. We are divorced north from south because we hated each other so. Mary Chestnut.
On the clear moonlit night of November 7th, 1837, a mob surrounded a warehouse at Alton, Illinois, intent on destroying an anti-slavery newspaper run by the Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy. When one of the mob moved to set the building on fire, Lovejoy, armed with a pistol, came out to stop him. The slavery men shot him dead and dumped his printing press into the Mississippi. The news stunned the nation. A white man had been killed over black slavery. Protest meetings were held throughout the North. One abolitionist wrote that thousands of our citizens who lately believed that they had nothing to do with slavery now begin to discover their error. In Hudson, Ohio, a clergyman told a church gathering, "The question now before us is no longer, can slaves be made free, but are we free, or are we slaves under mob law?" In the back of the church, a strange, gaunt man rose to his feet and raised his right hand.
Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. John Brown.
In 1846, a lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, was elected to Congress. He was born in Kentucky, the son of a farmer who could barely sign his name. He became a legislator at 24, a prosperous attorney, and after a turbulent courtship, the husband of Miss Mary Todd, the daughter of a slave-holding Kentucky banker. For Abraham Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence was to be taken literally. All men had the right to rise as far as talent would take them, just as he had. He detested slavery, but he called for its restriction, not immediate abolition. By mid-century, the country was deeply divided. Southerners feared the North might forbid slavery. Northerners feared slavery might move west. As each new state was added to the Union, it threatened to upset the delicate equilibrium of power.
There are grave doubts at the hugeness of the land and whether one government can comprehend the whole. Henry Adams.
Now events accelerated. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Its portrayal of slavery's cruelty moved readers as nothing else had. Queen Victoria wept over it, and within a year, more than 1.5 million copies were in print worldwide. In 1854, Congress allowed settlers in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide for themselves whether or not to permit slavery. Kansas exploded. 5,000 pro-slavery men invaded the territory. In the next 3 months, 200 men died in bleeding Kansas. The killing would not stop for 10 years. In 1857, the Supreme Court refused to free a slave, Dred Scott, even though he had lived for many years on free soil. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect.
As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Abraham Lincoln.
Violence reached the floor of the United States Senate, where Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina savagely beat abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner with his cane. Southern sympathizers sent Brooks new canes. Members began carrying knives and pistols into the chamber. Meanwhile, the nation's chief executive, James Buchanan, did nothing.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other.
On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led 5 blacks and 13 whites into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He brought along a wagon load of guns to arm the slaves he was sure would rally to him. Once they had, he planned to lead them southward along the crest of the Appalachians and destroy slavery. Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times in 6 states and defaulted on his debts. Yet he believed himself God's agent on earth. In 1856, at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, he and his sons had hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, all in the name of defeating Satan and his legions. Brown and his men quietly seized the armory, arsenal, and engine house and took up hostages, including George Washington's great-grandnephew. After that, nothing went right. The first person killed was the town baggage master, a free black. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did. The first of Brown's followers to fall was Dangerfield Newby, a former slave. Someone in the crowd cut off his ears as souvenirs. On Tuesday morning, federal troops arrived from Washington, led by a U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee. Lee's men stormed the engine house, and 9 more of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown, severely wounded, was turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason.
In firing his gun, John Brown has merely told what time of day it is. It is high noon. Thank God. William Lloyd Garrison.
An undivided South says, let him hang. Albany, Georgia Patriot.
Virginia found Brown guilty and sentenced him to death. Among the troops at the scene of his hanging were cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, led by an eccentric professor, Thomas J. Jackson. Also there was a private in the Richmond Greys, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth.
December 2nd, 1859. Old John Brown has been executed for treason against a state. We cannot object, even though he agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. That cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. It could avail him nothing that he might think himself right. Abraham Lincoln.
Ralph Waldo Emerson likened Brown to Christ. Nathaniel Hawthorne declared, "No man ever more justly hanged." And Herman Melville called him the meteor of the war. Brown had said nothing from the gallows, but he did hand one of his guards a note.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
His zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light. His was as the burning sun. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for him.
John Brown, very important person in history. Important for only one episode. Failure in everything in life, except he becomes the single most important factor, in my opinion, in bringing on the war. The militia system in the South, which had been a joke before then, becomes a viable instrument as the Southern militias begin to take a true form, and the South begins to worry about Northerners agitating the blacks to murder them in their beds.
It was the beginning of the Confederate Army.
The feeling among the Southern members for dissolution of the Union is becoming more general. Men are now beginning to talk of it seriously who 12 months ago hardly permitted themselves to think of it. The crisis is not far ahead. Alexander Stevens.
The country was coming apart. In the presidential election of 1860, Buchanan happily stepped aside, but not before his ruling Democratic Party was fatally split over the issue of slavery. The Republicans, a new party, saw their chance and nominated Abraham Lincoln, a moderate. His platform pledged only to halt slavery's further spread.
On that point hold firm as with a chain of steel. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it.
Radical abolitionists in the North complained that Lincoln's opposition to slavery did not go far enough. But to most people in the South, the prospect of Lincoln's election posed a lethal threat. The 1860 campaign had become a referendum on the Southern way of life. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the vote. He did not even appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states.
The election of Mr. Lincoln is undoubtedly the greatest evil that has ever befallen this country. But the mischief is done, and the only relief for the American people is to shorten sail, send down the topmasts, and prepare for a hurricane. Richmond Whig.
In the South, Lincoln was burned in effigy, and now the South Carolina legislature called for a convention to consider seceding from the Union.
Southerners would have told you they were fighting for self-government. They believed the gathering of power in Washington was against them. When they entered into that federation, they certainly would never have entered into it if they hadn't believed it'd be possible to get out. And when the time came that they wanted to get out, they thought they had every right. Southerners saw the election of Lincoln as a sign that the Union was about to be radicalized and that they were about to be taken in directions they did not care to go. The abolitionist aspect of it was very strong, and they figured they were about to lose what they call their property and faced ruin.
Yet many Southerners thought secession was madness. South Carolina, one Southern politician wrote, is too small for a republic and too large for an insane asylum.
November 19th, 1860. A most gloomy day in Wall Street. Everything at a deadlock. First-class paper not negotiable. Stocks falling. George Templeton Strong.
In New York, emotions were no less explosive, and George Templeton Strong, a conservative lawyer who distrusted Lincoln, began to keep track of events in his diary.
The bird of our country is a debilitated chicken disguised in eagle feathers. We have never been a nation. We are only an aggregate of communities, ready to fall apart at the first serious shock.
When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, there were 33 states in the Union, and a 34th, free Kansas, was about to join. By the time of his inauguration, 5 months later, just 27 states would remain. The suddenness of secession took everyone by surprise. South Carolina led the way on December 20th. A bell in Charleston tolled the succession of departing states. Mississippi on January 9th. Florida on the 10th. Then Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston was deposed when he tried to stop his state from joining the Confederacy.
Let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence, but I doubt it. The North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche.
Texas left anyway. Even Virginia, the most populous southern state, birthplace of 7 presidents, seems sure to follow.
All the indications are that this treasonable inflammation, secessionitis, keeps on making steady progress, week by week. If disunion becomes an established fact, we have one consolation. The self-amputated members were diseased beyond immediate cure, and their virus will infect our system no longer. George Templeton Strong.
The Charleston Mercury. The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated.